The heavy, gold-embossed invitation felt like a 40-pound weight in Mark's hands, its sharp edges digging uncomfortably into the calluses on his palms. He stood perfectly still in the dimly lit hallway of his suburban home, staring at the swirling, pretentious calligraphy that felt like a formal decree of his own failure. Glancing up, he caught his reflection in the entryway mirror, absent-mindedly running a tense hand through his thick, meticulously styled hair to compose himself. Even dressed down after a long day, Mark possessed a sharp, striking jawline and the broad, imposing shoulders of a man who spent his endless frustrations lifting heavy weights at the local gym. Feeling suffocated, he unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his crisp white dress shirt, exposing his chest to the cool air of the house and letting out a heavy, exhausted sigh. The return address on the thick envelope was a custom sticker silver foil, minimalist, incredibly expensive, and designed to make a statement of wealth before it was even opened. It was undeniably the aesthetic of his ex-wife, Jessica, a woman who treated every aspect of her life like a highly curated, fiercely competitive museum exhibit. He could easily picture Jessica in his mind with her perfect blonde hair, her dramatically expressive face, and her relentless penchant for high society theatrics. But the name printed elegantly next to hers was what really made his stomach churn with a sickening blend of lingering resentment and bitter betrayal. Liam Sterling. Mark tossed the thick cardstock onto the kitchen counter with a harsh flick of his wrist, letting it slide to a stop next to a cold, forgotten cup of morning coffee. He leaned heavily against the cheap Formica, closing his eyes tightly and visualizing the beautiful blonde woman who used to share this very kitchen with him. She was marrying a hedge fund manager, a man who looked like he had just stepped out of a luxury watch commercial and owned half of Manhattan. Mark could already picture the groom vividly. Tall, slicked-back dark hair, wearing a bespoke black tuxedo tailored to perfection, complete with a flawless silk bow tie. Opening his eyes, Mark glared at the offending invitation once more, his intense gaze locking onto one specific, incredibly condescending line of text at the bottom. Guest, +1. It was a cruel, highly calculated courtesy from Jessica, masked as standard wedding etiquette to make her look magnanimous to their mutual friends. She knew perfectly well that Mark hadn't been on a single serious date in the 3 agonizing years since their divorce had been finalized. The +1 wasn't an olive branch or a polite gesture. It was a brilliant spotlight deliberately meant to highlight his ongoing solitude and lack of moving on. She wanted him to walk into that opulent grand hall entirely alone, running a gauntlet of pitying looks from their old social circle. She wanted to see him standing there in the background, the defeated ex-husband, while she glowed in her pristine, outrageously expensive white gown, looking absolutely shocked that he even showed up. Mark picked up the invitation again, rubbing his thumb over the raised gold lettering as a dark, stubborn sense of pride flared up in his chest. He thought about just throwing the thick paper directly into the trash can, and completely ignoring the entire humiliating affair. But then his gaze drifted to the refrigerator door, where a brightly colored crayon drawing was proudly held up by a plastic magnet. It was drawn by his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, depicting a happy stick figure with bright yellow hair standing next to a disproportionately large building. Lily had been talking endlessly about her mommy's beautiful Princess Day for months, her innocent excitement entirely devoid of the complex adult pain surrounding the event. If Mark didn't show up, his little girl would be devastated looking for him in the crowd, and Jessica would undoubtedly use his absence as ultimate ammunition against his character. He was trapped. He had to go to the wedding, and he had to pretend that everything was perfectly, wonderfully fine for Lily's sake. But the agonizing thought of standing alone in a sea of judging eyes, watching the blonde bride gasp and smile at her lavish new life, felt physically suffocating. He desperately needed to clear his head, to escape the silent, mocking walls of his kitchen before the anxiety entirely consumed him. Mark grabbed a dark canvas jacket from the hallway hook, throwing it carelessly over his unbuttoned white shirt without bothering to zip it up. He stepped out into the biting November wind, the sudden, freezing cold, instantly stinging his face and shocking his system back to reality. The suburban neighborhood was eerily quiet, the dark streets slick and reflective with the icy remnants of an afternoon freezing rain. He walked briskly, his heavy boots thudding rhythmically against the wet pavement, his warm breath pluming in thick white clouds in the icy night air. He deliberately avoided the bright festive main streets adorned with early holiday lights, turning instead down a darker, grittier industrial road that led toward the city's subway lines. Flickering, dying streetlights cast long, erratic shadows across the cracked brick walls of abandoned warehouses and closed auto shops. The distant, heavy rumble of an underground train vibrated up through the concrete, sending a faint tremor through the solace of his shoes. Up ahead in the gloom, the erratic red and white neon sign of a failing, rundown 24-hour diner buzzed aggressively like an angry, trapped hornet. As he approached the desolate intersection, the sharp, pungent smell of stale black coffee, wet trash, and passing exhaust fumes filled the freezing air. That was the exact moment he saw her. She was sitting directly on the filthy concrete at the corner, huddled over a rusted subway grate that was actively venting warm, foul-smelling air from the tunnels below. Mark stopped dead in his tracks, lingering instinctively in the deep shadows of an adjacent alleyway to observe her without being seen. She wasn't an older vagrant worn down by decades on the street, nor was she someone lost in the familiar, tragic haze of substance abuse. She was young, incredibly young, with a wild mane of long, wavy brown hair that fell in thick, tangled cascades over her thin shoulders. Even from a distance, through the dim lighting and the grime, the sharp, aristocratic, and elegant bone structure of her face was completely undeniable. Heavy smudges of dark dirt and city soot streaked her pale cheeks and forehead, but they completely failed to hide her natural, striking, almost heartbreaking beauty. Her large, profoundly expressive eyes were focused intently downward, completely ignoring the bitter cold wind that was whipping around the street corner. She was wearing the most unusual, baffling garment he had ever seen on the rough streets of the city. It was a bizarrely tattered gray-brown, coarse-knit dress or oversized tunic, heavily distressed and literally falling apart at the rough seams. Large, deliberately frayed holes exposed the raw skin of her shoulders and arms, making her look less like a homeless woman and more like a displaced, tragic character from a medieval play. Despite the literal rags she wore and the thick grime masking her face, she possessed an overwhelming aura of quiet, untouchable dignity. She sat perfectly straight, her posture impeccably aligned, not slumped or defeated like the other broken souls who usually occupied these grates. Mark narrowed his eyes, realizing she was holding something very close to her face, angling it carefully to catch the dim, erratic light of the diner's buzzing neon sign. It was a thick paperback book, completely missing its front cover, its remaining pages swollen, warped, and deeply wrinkled from severe water damage. She was reading, completely and utterly absorbed in the text, her dirt-smudged lips moving just slightly as she silently traced the words with a delicate finger. Something massive shifted deep in Mark's chest, a sudden, inexplicable tightening that felt like a lock clicking open after years of rust. He looked at her stunning, dirt-streaked face, taking in the bizarre, tattered gray clothes with the gaping holes in the sleeves. Then, his mind aggressively flashed back to Jessica's pristine, suffocating world of perfect white dresses, expensive champagne, and arrogant gold-embossed invitations. An idea, wild, reckless, and incredibly impulsive, began to take rapid root in his racing mind. He realized he absolutely didn't want to hire a fake, polished escort who would sip champagne daintily and pretend to laugh at his jokes to impress his ex-wife. He wanted to bring someone intensely real, someone who had survived the absolute bottom, whose mere authentic presence would shatter the shallow, manicured perfection of Jessica's grand event. He stepped out of the alleyway shadows and crossed the quiet street, his footsteps slow, heavy, and deliberate as he approached the steaming subway grate. As his tall shadow finally fell over her, blocking the neon light, she looked up quickly, her body tensing as if expecting a blow or a cruel command to move along. Mark was momentarily paralyzed, entirely captivated by the profound depth and sorrow swimming in her large brown eyes. There was distinct, sharp fear there, but also a fierce, unyielding, and piercing intelligence that commanded immediate, absolute respect. Up close, the shredded holes in her torn gray sleeves looked even more severe, exposing delicate skin that was heavily goosebumped from the relentless November chill. I'm really sorry to interrupt you, Mark said softly, ensuring his deep voice carried a gentle, non-threatening tone over the howling wind. She slowly closed the battered book, holding it tightly and protectively to her chest, and waited in absolute, guarded silence for the handsome stranger to state his business. Mark looked down at his own unbuttoned, crisp white shirt, the stark contrast of his life suddenly glaring, and then looked back at her beautiful, fiercely dirt-smudged face. I have an invitation to a ridiculously opulent black-tie wedding this weekend, he began, the crazy words tumbling out of his mouth before logic could stop them. There will be endless hot food, a beautifully heated room, and I desperately need someone entirely real to walk in there with me. The young woman stared up at him, the red neon light perfectly catching the grime on her cheek and the intense, calculating skepticism in her eyes. "Will you be my plus one?" he asked, holding his breath in the freezing air as he waited for the beautiful, ruined woman to answer. The bitter wind howled around the desolate intersection, aggressively whipping the tattered, hole-ridden fabric of her gray tunic as she stared up at him from the steaming concrete grate. Mark held his breath in the freezing air, acutely aware of exactly how insane his impromptu proposition sounded to a vulnerable woman whose primary concern was simply surviving the night. Her large, profoundly expressive brown eyes narrowed slightly, searching his face and scanning the sharp, tense lines of his jaw for any hidden malice or cruel trickery. She looked at his unbuttoned, crisp white shirt and his expensive boots, silently calculating the massive, incomprehensible gulf between his comfortable reality and her desperate, freezing existence. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound between them was the erratic, angry buzzing of the failing neon diner sign casting a harsh red glow over her dirt-streaked cheeks. "I will go with you," she finally said, her voice unexpectedly melodic and surprisingly steady, despite the violent shivers that were actively racking her thin, frail frame. She carefully placed her battered, waterlogged book into a plastic grocery bag, her movements slow and deliberate, protecting her sole possession as if it were made of solid gold. "But only," she added, looking fiercely up into his eyes with a dignity that entirely defied her filthy surroundings, "if I do not have to pretend to be someone I am not." Mark felt a massive wave of relief wash over his chest, followed immediately by a surge of profound respect for the uncompromising boundary she had just drawn on a freezing sidewalk. "Deal," Mark agreed softly, extending his large, warm hand to help her up from the filthy, damp concrete where she had been huddled for hours. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her freezing, soot-stained fingers into his palm, allowing him to gently pull her to her feet. Up close, the heavy scent of city exhaust and stale rain clung to her, but beneath it, Mark could sense the fragile, exhausted humanity of a woman pushed to the absolute brink. He unzipped his heavy canvas jacket without a second thought, draping it carefully over her shivering shoulders to cover the gaping, frayed holes of her bizarre gray dress. She pulled the oversized jacket tightly around herself, burying her face into the warm, fleece-lined collar as they began the short but completely life-altering walk back to his car. The drive to his suburban house was heavily silent, the rhythmic hum of the car's heater slowly thawing the dangerous deep-seated chill that had settled into her bones. She kept her face turned toward the passenger window, watching the passing streetlights illuminate her dirt-smudged features, lost in a quiet world of trauma that Mark couldn't even begin to fathom. When they finally pulled into his driveway, Mark felt a sudden, sharp spike of anxiety, wondering if his messy, lived-in home would overwhelm someone accustomed to the vast emptiness of the streets. He unlocked the front door and gently ushered her inside, the warm air of the hallway wrapping around them as the faint scent of lavender detergent and burnt toast greeted them. She stood frozen in the entryway, her large eyes darting nervously around the domestic space, looking at the scattered toys and family photos as if they were artifacts from an alien planet. "You are safe here," Mark said quietly, sensing her overwhelming fight-or-flight instinct, keeping his distance to ensure she didn't feel cornered or trapped in the enclosed space. He led her down the hall to the small, unused guest bedroom, pushing open the door to reveal a neatly made bed with thick, plush blankets and a connected private bathroom. "There are clean towels on the rack, hot water that never runs out, and a lock on the inside of the door," he explained. Ensuring his tone was entirely neutral and unthreatening, he quickly gathered a stack of his own comfortable clothes, a soft gray sweatshirt and thick cotton sweatpants, and placed them gently on the edge of the mattress. "Take all the time you need," he told her, stepping backward out of the room and softly pulling the door shut, listening for the immediate, reassuring click of the lock turning. For the next hour, Mark sat alone in his quiet kitchen, staring at the gold-embossed wedding invitation on the counter, listening to the distant, continuous rush of the shower running down the hall. When the bathroom door finally opened, Mark stood up from the counter, entirely unprepared for the staggering transformation that was about to step into his hallway. The thick layers of dark city grime and suffocating street soot had been completely washed away, revealing skin that was strikingly pale and flawlessly clear. Her wild, tangled mane of brown hair was now damp and combed back, falling in heavy, dark waves over the shoulders of his oversized gray sweatshirt. Without the heavy dirt masking her features, her aristocratic bone structure was even more prominent. Her jawline sharp and her dark brown eyes incredibly large and luminous. She looked incredibly young, profoundly exhausted, and hauntingly beautiful, stepping hesitantly into the kitchen like a skittish deer testing the safety of a clearing. Over the next 2 days, they settled into a quiet, respectful rhythm, sharing simple meals and allowing the safety of the house to slowly chip away at her severe, defensive shell. He learned her name was Sarah, and he learned that her fierce, quiet dignity was a heavy armor forged by a rapid, brutal series of tragic losses that had left her entirely alone. By Thursday afternoon, the impending reality of Jessica's high society wedding loomed over them, and the time had come to find a dress that would make a statement. Mark drove them to a modest but elegant boutique in the better part of town, feeling a strange, protective pride as Sarah walked beside him, holding her head high. The boutique was brightly lit with crystal chandeliers, smelling strongly of expensive perfume and the crisp, starchy scent of brand-new, high-end fabrics. A sharply dressed saleswoman immediately approached them, her eyes darting critically over Sarah's borrowed, oversized sweatpants and Mark's casual, unbuttoned collar. Sarah didn't flinch or look away from the judgmental gaze. Instead, she offered the woman a perfectly polite, remarkably composed smile that instantly demanded respect. Mark guided her toward the formal wear section, his hands trailing over racks of shimmering silks, heavy satins, and delicate lace, looking for something that captured her unique spirit. They bypassed the loud, flashy sequins and the overly dramatic, structural gowns, completely ignoring the styles that Jessica and her wealthy friends would typically gravitate toward. Then, tucked away near the back of a tightly packed circular rack, Mark spotted a flash of deep, mesmerizing color that instantly caught his eye. He pulled the hanger free, revealing a floor-length, sleeveless gown made of heavy, luxurious silk that was the exact, vibrant shade of a dark emerald. It was entirely unadorned, relying solely on the brilliant, striking color and the masterful, elegant draping of the fabric rather than cheap beads or excessive lace. "Try this one," Mark suggested, handing the heavy silk garment to Sarah, noticing how the rich green fabric immediately brought out hidden, golden flecks in her dark eyes. Sarah took the dress, a fleeting look of genuine wonder crossing her face as she felt the smooth, cool silk slide through her still-recovering, calloused fingers. She disappeared into the plush fitting room, pulling the heavy velvet curtain entirely shut, leaving Mark to stand nervously by a velvet armchair, waiting for the reveal. Minutes stretched on, the anticipation building in Mark's chest, as he heard the faint rustle of fabric and the soft click of a zipper being pulled into place. When the velvet curtain finally swept open, the breath was instantly and forcefully knocked entirely out of Mark's lungs. The emerald dress fit her as if it had been custom-tailored by a master seamstress specifically for the delicate, elegant lines of her body. The deep green silk cascaded beautifully down her frame, pooling slightly at her feet, contrasting violently and perfectly with her pale skin and dark, cascading hair. She stepped out onto the small pedestal, her posture impeccably straight, her chin raised, exuding an aura of classical, almost royal elegance that money simply couldn't buy. The saleswoman, who had been hovering nearby with a clipboard, stopped dead in her tracks, completely silencing her previous judgmental attitude as she stared in open, undeniable awe. Mark couldn't speak. He could only stare at the woman who, just days ago, had been shivering over a rusted subway grate in a tattered, hole-ridden gray tunic. The transformation was not just physical. It was deeply spiritual, a magnificent resurrection of the proud. Brilliant woman she had been before the world had cruelly broken her down. "It is perfect," Mark finally managed to whisper, his voice rough with an entirely unexpected surge of deep, overwhelming emotion. The real test, however, came on Friday evening when Mark's 7-year-old daughter, Lily, was dropped off by Jessica's frantic, stressed-out nanny for the weekend. Lily burst through the front door like a tiny hurricane, dropping her pink backpack on the floor and immediately running toward the kitchen to find her father. She skidded to a sudden halt in the hallway, her small, light-up sneakers squeaking loudly on the hardwood floor as she saw a strange woman standing by the living room window. Sarah was wearing one of Mark's simple sweaters, but she had styled her hair beautifully, and the profound, peaceful grace she carried naturally filled the small suburban room. Lily's eyes went completely wide, taking in the striking, beautiful woman who looked so vastly different from her own highly manicured, perfectly blonde mother. Sarah slowly lowered herself down until she was eye level with the little girl, ensuring her movements were gentle and entirely unthreatening to the child. "Hello, Lily," Sarah said softly, her melodic voice carrying a warm, genuine maternal affection that instantly softened the cautious, guarded look on the little girl's face. Lily took a hesitant step forward, entirely captivated by the kind, deep brown eyes and the gentle, tragic smile of the stranger in her house. "My dad says you're going to the wedding with him," Lily whispered, her small voice echoing slightly in the quiet hallway. "I am," Sarah replied, nodding gracefully. "He told me it was a very special day, and I needed to make sure I looked my absolute best." Lily pointed a small, curious finger toward the garment bag hanging carefully on the closet door, her eyes shining with innocent excitement. "Is that your dress?" Sarah carefully unzipped the top of the black bag, just enough to reveal the shimmering, deep green silk of the emerald gown tucked safely inside. Lily gasped, her small hands flying up to cover her mouth as she stared at the luxurious fabric. "You look like a queen," the little girl whispered in pure awe. Sarah smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that lit up the entire room, and gently took one of Lily's small, warm hands in her own. "And you, my dear," Sarah said, her voice thick with suppressed emotion, "are the princess of this castle, and it is an honor to meet you." Watching them together from the kitchen doorway, seeing the gentle, pure connection forming between his daughter and this incredible survivor, Mark felt a massive, fundamental shift within his soul. He suddenly realized that this entire chaotic weekend was no longer about showing up as ex-wife, or proving a petty point to Liam Sterling and his wealthy friends. It was entirely about restoring a forgotten woman's dignity, honoring her profound resilience, and allowing the incredible strength of her spirit to shine brighter than any diamond in that room. The heavy, imposing mahogany doors of the Sterling estate closed behind them with a definitive, echoing thud, instantly cutting off the deafening roar of the shocked wedding guests. The sudden biting cold of the crisp November night hit them immediately, a sharp and welcome contrast to the suffocating, perfumed heat of the opulent grand ballroom. Mark kept his hand gently but firmly placed on the small of Sarah's back, guiding her down the sweeping, brightly lit marble steps toward the circular gravel driveway. He didn't look back at the massive, glowing windows of the mansion, having absolutely no desire to see Jessica's furious, defeated face staring down at them from the glass. The valet, a young man who had witnessed their triumphant exit, hurried forward with Mark's modest sedan, his eyes wide with an unspoken, awestruck respect for the dark-haired woman in green. Mark opened the passenger door, the crisp wind whipping the heavy emerald silk of her gown around her ankles as she slid gracefully into the leather seat. He walked around the hood of the car, his unbuttoned white dress shirt fluttering in the freezing breeze, the sharp chill finally cooling the massive adrenaline spike in his veins. Sliding into the driver's seat, he firmly shut the door, instantly sealing them inside the quiet, intimate sanctuary of the vehicle, far away from the judging eyes of high society. He turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life as he immediately cranked the heater up to its maximum setting to ward off the deep autumn chill. The drive away from the sprawling, heavily gated estate was completely silent, the tires crunching rhythmically against the pristine white gravel until they finally hit the smooth, dark asphalt of the main road. The heavy, suffocating tension that had gripped Mark's chest for weeks completely dissolved, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He glanced over at the passenger seat, watching the rhythmic passing of the amber streetlights cast moving shadows across Sarah's striking, pale face. She was staring intently out the window, her wild, wavy brown hair falling over her shoulders, her hands folded quietly in her lap, her breathing slow and beautifully measured. The majestic, heartbreaking echoes of the Chopin piece she had just played so brilliantly still seemed to vibrate softly in the confined space between them. "Are you all right?" Mark finally asked, his deep voice breaking the heavy silence, ensuring his tone was gentle and completely free of any lingering, aggressive party adrenaline. Sarah didn't turn her head away from the glass immediately, taking a long, deep breath as she watched the dark, skeletal silhouettes of the autumn trees blur past. "I haven't touched a piano in over 2 years," she whispered softly, her melodic voice trembling slightly with the massive, suppressed weight of her newly awakened emotions. "I was terrified that my hands would entirely forget the keys, that the devastating cold of the streets had completely frozen the music right out of my bones." She slowly turned to face him, the warm glow of the dashboard softly illuminating the deep, profound gratitude swimming in her large, dark brown eyes. "But the moment I sat down, it was as if no time had passed at all. The music was exactly where I had left it, waiting patiently for me to return." Mark kept his eyes focused on the dark, winding road ahead, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel tightly as a thick knot of pure emotion rose in his throat. "You are absolutely magnificent in there, Sarah," he said firmly, his voice rough with absolute sincerity. "You didn't just play a song, you entirely stopped time." A small, heartbreakingly fragile smile played across her lips, the first genuine expression of untethered joy he had seen on her face since he found her on that terrible grate. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that extended far beyond the events of the lavish, ridiculous wedding they had just crashed. Not just for the extravagant food, the incredibly hot showers, or this breathtakingly beautiful dress that makes me feel like a human being again. She reached out across the center console, her slender, pale fingers gently touching the rough, calloused edge of his right hand resting on the gear shift. "Thank you for looking down at a filthy, broken woman huddled over a steaming subway grate and actually seeing a person who was still worth saving." Mark pulled the car over to the curb in front of his quiet, dark suburban apartment building, shifting the engine into park and turning off the ignition completely. The sudden silence of the engine dying left only the soft, rhythmic ticking of the cooling metal and the faint sound of their shared breathing in the dark cabin. The petty, spiteful satisfaction he had so desperately thought he would feel about upstaging Jessica and her wealthy new husband was completely and utterly gone. In its place was a deep, grounding, and incredibly powerful sense of purpose. A realization that this fateful night had fundamentally changed the trajectory of his entire life. He turned his body entirely toward her, looking deeply into her dark eyes, wanting to make absolutely sure she understood the profound truth of what had just happened. "You didn't need me to magically make you a person, Sarah," Mark said softly, his deep voice echoing with unwavering conviction in the quiet car. "You just needed a piano and a single momentary break from the relentless cruelty of the world to remind yourself of exactly who you already were." He gently turned his hand over, catching her delicate fingers in his own, feeling the lingering, icy chill of the city streets that had not entirely left her skin. "I am not taking you back to that intersection," he stated firmly, leaving absolutely zero room for argument or polite refusal in his tone. "You can stay in the guest room for as long as it takes. A week, a month, a year. I don't care. You are absolutely not going back to sleeping on concrete." Sarah stared at him, her beautiful, aristocratic face crumbling slightly as the immense, exhausting wall of her defensive survival instincts finally shattered completely. A single, hot tear escaped the corner of her eye, tracking slowly through the lingering remnants of her makeup, but she nodded her head in silent, overwhelmed agreement. That incredible, transformative night was not the neat, tidy conclusion of their bizarre story. Rather, it was the raw, beautiful prologue to a much larger life. The following Monday morning, Mark meticulously packed the heavy emerald silk dress away in a protective garment bag, preserving the beautiful armor that had saved them both. Sarah returned to wearing his oversized, comfortable gray sweatpants, but she no longer carried herself like a cornered, terrified animal waiting for the next brutal strike. The deep, suffocating layers of her trauma didn't magically vanish overnight, but the safety of Mark's quiet home provided the stable, solid foundation she needed to finally breathe. 2 weeks later, Mark surprised her by dragging a heavy, slightly battered electric keyboard through the front door, setting it up carefully in the corner of the small living room. When Lily came over for her next weekend visit, the energetic 7-year-old was immediately drawn to the fascinating instrument and the quiet, beautiful woman sitting in front of it. Sarah gently lifted the little girl onto her lap, her long, wavy brown hair brushing against Lily's cheek as she patiently guided the child's small fingers over the plastic keys. Mark stood quietly in the kitchen doorway, holding a warm cup of coffee, watching his young daughter laugh with pure delight as Sarah taught her the simplest, bright melodies. He saw the profound, nurturing maternal warmth that Sarah effortlessly poured into Lily, a deep, genuine affection that Jessica had been entirely too busy to ever provide. With Mark's unwavering encouragement and practical help, Sarah finally gathered the courage to apply for a specialized position at a highly respected local community arts center. Her audition piece was a complex, breathtaking classical sonata that completely floored the hiring committee, securing her a permanent role as their lead youth music instructor. Over the next 6 months, she thrived in her new environment, surrounded by the beautiful noise of learning children and the healing power of the music she had almost lost entirely. She meticulously saved every paycheck, her fierce independence driving her to eventually rent a small, sunlit apartment of her own just 3 short blocks away from Mark's house. But despite having her own space, she spent nearly every single evening sitting on Mark's worn living room couch, sharing simple dinners and quiet, comfortable conversations. The initial, intense dynamic of the desperate savior and the broken survivor slowly, beautifully evolved into a profound, perfectly balanced partnership of 2 equals. They'd bonded over their shared, painful understanding of sudden loss, their deep mutual respect, and the quiet, hilarious moments of raising a highly energetic 7-year-old together. Exactly 1 year after the infamous gold-embossed wedding invitation had arrived in the mail, Mark and Sarah stood quietly together in the kitchen of his suburban home. He was wearing a simple, unbuttoned white shirt, and she was leaning against the counter, her wild brown hair pulled back, laughing brightly at a terrible joke he had just made. Mark looked at her beautiful, glowing face, entirely free of the dark street grime and the heavy, suffocating shadows of her tragic past, and felt his heart swell with absolute certainty. He reached across the Formica counter, gently taking her hand in his, feeling the strong, confident pulse of a woman who had entirely reclaimed her own powerful life. He had initially gone to that opulent, aggressively hostile wedding, desperately hoping to prove to his arrogant ex-wife that he could easily survive the heavy blow of her leaving. Instead, by taking a massive, impulsive risk on a freezing, broken stranger huddled on a dark street corner, he had miraculously found the incredible woman who taught him how to truly live. The massive, wrought iron gates of the sterling countryside estate loomed ahead in the freezing November night, illuminated by harsh, sweeping security spotlights that cut through the darkness. Mark's tires crunched loudly against the pristine white gravel of the sweeping, circular driveway, pulling up slowly behind a long, intimidating line of idling black town cars. Valets in crisp, synchronized uniforms rushed forward, opening doors for old-money socialites wrapped in thick, luxurious furs and men in sharply tailored, bespoke tuxedos. Mark turned off the ignition, suddenly feeling the suffocating, anxious heat of his own restrictive clothing, realizing the immense pressure of the impending social gauntlet. In a sudden defiant act of rebellion against Jessica's rigid, oppressive world, he stripped off his charcoal suit jacket and tossed it carelessly into the back seat. He aggressively unbuttoned the top 3 buttons of his crisp white dress shirt, completely abandoning his tie, deciding he would rather look ruggedly authentic than painfully awkward. He walked around the car and opened the passenger door for Sarah, offering his hand as she stepped gracefully out into the biting, crisp autumn air. She was a breathtaking vision in the deep emerald silk, though she had insisted on leaving her long, wavy brown hair wild and loose around her shoulders. The untamed, natural cascade of her hair contrasted beautifully with the extreme formality of the gown, giving her an aura of raw, striking, and unpolished majesty. Together, they walked up the wide, sweeping marble steps of the grand estate, Mark in his unbuttoned white shirt and Sarah moving with quiet, devastating elegance beside him. The towering double doors were thrown open by attendants, revealing a cavernous, opulent ballroom dripping with massive crystal chandeliers and thousands of imported white orchids. The sheer volume of the room was overwhelming, filled with the deafening hum of wealthy, arrogant laughter and the sharp clinking sound of expensive crystal champagne flutes. As Mark and Sarah stepped over the threshold and entered the main reception area, the immediate atmosphere in their immediate vicinity seemed to physically shift and freeze. Mark kept his broad shoulders squared, his jaw tight, his intense gaze sweeping over the crowd as he protectively guided Sarah through the sea of glittering guests. Across the room, standing proudly beside a towering 6-tier champagne fountain, was Jessica, draped in a flawless, outrageously expensive white designer wedding gown. Her perfectly coiffed, bright blonde hair caught the light of the chandeliers, framing a face that was currently frozen in a mask of absolute, unadulterated shock. Jessica had fully expected Mark to slink into the room alone wearing an ill-fitting suit, looking utterly defeated and entirely broken by her grand public triumph. Instead, he stood tall, ruggedly handsome in his open white shirt, commanding the space beside a woman whose sheer, effortless beauty made every other guest look horribly overdone. Jessica's jaw physically dropped, her eyes wide and manic, instantly becoming the very picture of panicked, deeply insecure outrage as she stared at her transformed ex-husband. Beside the shocked blonde bride stood Liam Sterling, wearing his bespoke black tuxedo, his perpetually smug smile faltering slightly as he registered the undeniable threat of Mark's arrival. Liam placed a possessive hand on Jessica's waist, leaning in to whisper something in her ear, but her eyes never left the striking, dark-haired woman holding Mark's arm. Mark felt a deep, profoundly satisfying wave of vindication wash over his chest, but as he looked down at Sarah, the petty need for revenge instantly evaporated. Sarah was entirely oblivious to the vicious, silent social warfare happening across the room, her large brown eyes scanning the beautiful architecture with genuine, innocent appreciation. She didn't try to compete with the flashy diamonds or the aggressive, boastful conversations happening around them. Her silence was a brilliant, impenetrable armor. Several of Mark and Jessica's old mutual friends approached them hesitantly, their eyes darting curiously between Mark's unbuttoned collar and Sarah's mesmerizing, emerald-clad figure. When forced to make small talk, Sarah spoke with a quiet, articulate modesty that completely disarmed the incredibly judgmental, high-society crowd within mere seconds. She didn't invent a fake background or pretend to be a wealthy heiress. She simply offered polite, vague truths wrapped in a profoundly graceful, magnetic cadence. The dinner service was a blur of silver cloches, decadent, unfamiliar courses, and a relentless stream of forced, overly enthusiastic toasts praising Liam's vast financial empires. Through it all, Jessica kept shooting vicious, calculated glares at their table, completely unable to enjoy her own lavish wedding while Sarah effortlessly commanded the room's quiet attention. As the heavy dessert plates were finally cleared away, the hired jazz band concluded their lively set, stepping off the raised stage to take a well-deserved intermission. The massive, echoing ballroom was left with a dull, conversational roar, the guests migrating toward the fully stocked bars or stepping out onto the heated stone terraces. In the far corner of the room, partially obscured by a massive floral arrangement, sat a breathtakingly beautiful, antique Steinway grand piano, its polished ebony wood gleaming under the lights. Sarah stopped mid-sentence, her dark brown eyes locking onto the empty piano bench. her entire body tensing as a rush of buried, painful memories flooded her expression. Mark watched her face closely, seeing the profound, agonizing war between deep trauma and an overwhelming, irresistible yearning playing out in the subtle tightening of her jaw. "My late husband," Sarah whispered, her voice so soft and fragile that Mark had to lean in to hear it over the dull roar of the party. "He absolutely loved Chopin." Before Mark could fully process the weight of her devastating words, Sarah slowly pulled her arm free from his and began to drift silently across the crowded ballroom. She moved like a beautiful emerald ghost navigating through the loud, oblivious crowd, entirely focused on the magnificent wooden instrument waiting in the shadows. Mark followed a few paces behind, his heart pounding heavily against his ribs, intensely aware that something massive and entirely unscripted was about to happen. Sarah reached the piano and stood before it for a long, agonizing moment, gently running her pale, delicate fingers over the smooth, polished wood of the closed key cover. She slowly lifted the heavy lid, exposing the pristine black and ivory keys, staring down at them as if greeting an old, deeply cherished friend after a lifetime of separation. She sat down gracefully on the tufted leather bench, taking a moment to meticulously adjust the heavy, sweeping folds of her emerald silk skirt around her legs. She closed her eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to pull in all the lingering pain, cold, and suffering of her time huddled on the concrete subway grate. Then, with a gentle, agonizingly precise movement, she laid her hands on the keys and pressed down, releasing the first, incredibly pure notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The music didn't just casually enter the massive room. It forcefully commanded it, slicing through the arrogant chatter and the clinking glasses with terrifying, absolute authority. The first few chords were played with such raw, devastating emotion that a waiter carrying a tray of empty champagne flutes literally stopped dead in his tracks, utterly paralyzed. The melody swelled, rising up toward the crystal chandeliers, carrying the immense, crushing weight of her profound grief, her terrifying loneliness, and her shattered past. But intricately woven into that deep sorrow was a fierce, triumphant resilience, a beautiful declaration of her survival and her overwhelming gratitude for this single night of warmth. The dull roar of the wealthy crowd began to violently die down, the loud voices trailing off into confused, reverent whispers as the hauntingly beautiful music completely washed over them. One by one, the guests set down their expensive drinks, turning their bodies entirely toward the far corner of the room where the dark-haired woman played with closed eyes. Mark stood frozen a few feet away, his arms hanging uselessly at his sides, entirely consumed by the magnificent, tragic storm of sound erupting from the woman he had saved. He looked across the silent, completely captivated ballroom and saw Jessica, the shocked blonde bride, standing rigidly by the towering cake, her face drained of all its smug arrogance. For the first time in her entire meticulously curated life, Jessica was completely eclipsed, entirely upstaged at her own multi-million-dollar event by a woman she didn't even know. Liam Sterling stood perfectly still, his mouth slightly open, the aggressive, confident hedge fund manager completely silenced by a level of raw, artistic genius money could never purchase. Sarah swayed slightly on the bench, her wild, wavy brown hair falling over her face as her fingers danced across the keys with breathtaking, virtuosic speed and agonizing tenderness. Every single note was a profound testament to her humanity, a brutal reminder to the shallow room that true elegance was born from suffering, not from unlimited bank accounts. The final section of the piece slowed, the frantic, emotional storm tapering off into a series of soft, lingering, heartbreakingly delicate chords that hung heavy in the thick air. She pressed the very last key, letting the pure, resonating sound echo out into the absolute, suffocating stillness of the massive, crowded ballroom. She slowly lifted her hands from the ivory, bowing her head slightly, keeping her eyes closed as the final vibration of the piano string completely faded into nothingness. For 5 full, agonizingly long seconds, the enormous room was dead silent. No one coughed, no one whispered, no one even dared to take a breath. Then a single, definitive clap echoed from the back of the room, followed immediately by another, and then another, until the silence shattered entirely. A thunderous, deafening roar of absolute, unadulterated applause violently erupted from the hundreds of guests, shaking the very foundations of the opulent countryside estate. Wealthy socialites, arrogant politicians, and cynical businessmen alike were aggressively clapping. Some with literal tears standing in their eyes, entirely moved by the profound, unexpected performance. Mark stepped forward, his chest bursting with an overwhelming, indescribable pride, and gently offered his large hand to the brilliant, beautiful woman sitting on the bench. Sarah opened her dark brown eyes, looking up at him with a luminous, tear-streaked smile, and placed her delicate, trembling hand firmly into his. She stood up slowly, her emerald dress catching the light, and together they faced the roaring crowd, perfectly united against the backdrop of Jessica's shattered, shallow triumph. She had not just stolen the show. She had completely rearranged the fundamental emotional reality of the room, leaving an unforgettable, burning mark on every single soul present.